With the success of the Famicom trilogy, series director Hironobu Sakaguchi was now ready to enter the 16-bit generation of consoles. More importantly, for the first time since the first game, an English version of the game would come out alongside the Japanese version rather than years later. This English game would be released for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System as Final Fantasy II. Since they had already promoted the actual Final Fantasy II localization in magazines, and in an era before the internet, most Americans would have no way of knowing that this wasn't the very game they were promised. While this version of the game, the original SNES version known as Final Fantasy II, is the version I will be reviewing today, I will still call it by its original Japanese numbering just to avoid confusion with the original Final Fantasy II that I've already reviewed. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Final Fantasy IV Retrospective. Much like with Final Fantasy II and III, Square initially had plans for Hironobu Sakaguchi and his team to develop two Final Fantasy games simultaneously with each other: Final Fantasy IV for the Famicom and Final Fantasy V for the Super Famicom. I wonder if this was intended to be a regular thing with the Final Fantasy games: make them in pairs, but release them separately from each other. However, Square soon realized that they didn't have the budget to make two games at a time, so they ultimately decided to scrap the proto version of Final Fantasy IV, instead taking the upcoming Final Fantasy V and renaming it as Final Fantasy IV instead. This screenshot right here is the only known gameplay footage of that game. It was published in a Japanese magazine once, but was never heard from again. Sakaguchi has stated that the Famicom game was approximately 80% complete. He also states that the good ideas were reused for the Super Famicom game that was actually released, although he provides us with fuck-all details about exactly what ideas were originally intended for the Famicom game. As I pointed out in my Final Fantasy II retrospective, the lead designer for that game and its sequel Final Fantasy III, Nazir Gabali, was actually a US citizen whose visa had expired about halfway through development, forcing him to return to the USA. So to fill the empty slot left by him, a former part-time employee of Square, Takashi Tokita, stepped up to the plate. He had actually worked part-time on every Final Fantasy game up to this point, working on graphics for Final Fantasy I, QA testing for Final Fantasy II, and sound effects for Final Fantasy III. Perhaps it was his extensive experience working on the Final Fantasy franchise, combined with his wide variety of experience working on different aspects of the games, that caused him to be accepted for the position of lead designer with Gabelli left behind. When developing Final Fantasy IV, Sakaguchi and his team endeavored to take the best traits of the 3 previous Final Fantasy games and combine them into one game. The 3 elements they chose were the elemental themes of the first game, the focus on story of the second, and the job system of the third game. Now, if you've seen my retrospective videos of the past 3 games, you'd know that I take a slight amount of umbrage with those choices. For me, the biggest strength in Final Fantasy I wasn't the fact that it used the 4 Greek elements as inspiration for its main bosses, although to be fair, I'm saying that with more than 30 years of hindsight, so maybe back then having the 4 Greek elements be the basis for your game's symbolism was actually a fairly unique and original idea. Rather, its biggest strength was in its structure and pacing. Its 4 elemental fiends and the 4 corresponding orbs meant that the game had a natural progression towards the end. Earth Fiend, Fire Fiend, Water Fiend, Air Fiend, Final Boss, and credits. Wham bam thank you man. The game not never, but rarely, bogged down with unnecessary padding, unlike the next 2 games, which seem to just throw dungeons and enemies at the player with no regard for cohesion or proper pacing, until Sakaguchi just arbitrarily decided, yeah, I think that's enough dungeons, here's the final boss for you. As I mentioned in the Final Fantasy III retrospective, its jump system was not its strongest element either, as all that really seemed to do was bog down the game's leveling system by adding in a completely pointless extra step. If I had to select the strongest part of that game, I would have to go with the Peanut Gallery. But of course, those guys can't be brought back for Final Fantasy IV since the series is an anthology. Not that this will stop Sakaguchi from bringing back other characters for no reason. However, if I had to select an idea that would actually be reused for Final Fantasy IV, it would have to be the way the player's transportation vessel was upgraded throughout the game. Sadly, that does not make a reappearance in this game. However, not everything that was intended for this game made it into the game, and I'm not even talking about the English localization either. A first-generation Super Famicom cartridge was capable of holding a megabyte of data. Compare that to the cartridge for Final Fantasy III, which was able to hold 512 kilobytes of data. So the first generation of cartridges for the Super Famicom could hold twice as much data as the last generation of cartridges for the regular Famicom. Cool, more story content, right? Well, not really. See, this wasn't just a text-only adventure like the kind that was common with the VIC-20. See, because the Super Famicom also had a superior processor to the Famicom, it was capable of 16-bit graphics as opposed to the 8-bit graphics of the Famicom. However, that alone is going to take up more cartridge space than its 8-bit counterpart. This means that, if anything, there was less room in the cartridge for actual storytelling than in the Final Fantasy III cartridge. Sakaguchi has said that an estimated 75% of the game's dialogue had to be cut due to cartridge storage limits. He claims that only unnecessary dialogue was cut, not essential story elements. However, he doesn't tell us what exactly counts as unnecessary dialogue. Sometimes mere flavor text can greatly enhance a story, primarily because it shows character. As it stands, about half the game's main cast are complete blank slates. Without knowing exactly what was cut, I have no way of knowing if I agree or not that the dialogue was indeed necessary. In any case, Final Fantasy IV was released on July 19th, 1991 in Japan and November 23rd, 1991 in North America. However, the localization efforts alone deserve a section unto itself, so that leads us to... As I was posting a community post saying that I was playing this game for the purposes of this retrospective video, one of my subscribers actually asked what version I've chosen. Just to clarify, I am not just arbitrarily picking which versions of these games I'll be reviewing. At least for the first 6 games in the series, I will be reviewing the versions of these games where they were originally released in an official capacity in North America. This means no fan translations allowed, only the official releases in North America. So when I reviewed Final Fantasy I, it was on the NES. When I reviewed Final Fantasy II, that wasn't ported to the NES. It has since been ported numerous times in English, but its first official English port was for the PlayStation 1 as Final Fantasy Origins. Final Fantasy III was not brought over to the USA until 2006 for the Nintendo DS. Like Final Fantasy II, it has since been released in English many times, but its original North American release was on the Nintendo DS. This game, Final Fantasy IV, was originally released in North America as Final Fantasy II for the Super NES. So that is the version I am playing here. For Final Fantasy V, I will be reviewing the PS1 version of the game, Final Fantasy Anthology, because once again, that is the first time the game saw an official English release. Last but not least, Final Fantasy III on the Super NES will be the version of Final Fantasy VI that I review. Now, the reason why I am reviewing the games like this is because the stories for how and why these games came to be released in North America in such a wonky order provides good discussion fodder in and of itself. However, once I get to Final Fantasy VII, Square will by that point have gotten the art of localizing their games in English down to a science. I may still talk about the game's development if there's anything worth talking about, but the English localization will have become fairly standard procedure by that point. So, because there will no longer be a compelling reason for me to review the original English versions of the games, I will instead just review the versions of every game from Final Fantasy VII through 15 that are available on Steam. Now that that's out of the way, let's discuss the actual localization of this game. As I mentioned earlier, this game already pushed the first generation SNES cartridges to their limit even in Japanese. As I mentioned in the Final Fantasy II retrospective, Japanese has a much more compact system of writing than English. This means that, when translating the game from Japanese to English, you're going to have to either increase the file size for the game, or remove stuff from it. However, as I mentioned earlier, even the Japanese version of the game pushed the first generation of SNES cartridges to their limit. Maybe they could have waited patiently for the later cartridges that had more space, but then again, fellow Square developer Hiromichi Tanaka explained that, at the time, the whole new generation of consoles thing was uncharted territory, so perhaps they didn't expect the Super Famicom to get any more cartridge space. So that means that content had to be cut from the game. However, with a handful of exceptions, it doesn't really show. The translations don't exactly scream out that something was missing, like the proto-cartridge for the original Final Fantasy II English localization supposedly was. Sure, there are the occasional bits of English, such as the characters saying "we are late" when it's clear that they're supposed to say "we're too late," although to be fair, even the sentence "we are late" is still technically a grammatically correct sentence, just one that isn't appropriate in that specific context. But for the most part, I never felt that anything was truly missing from the game, unless some character arcs were cut out of the English translation. However, given my experiences with the past 2 games, which were ported onto much later consoles for their English versions and thus didn't have the excuse of limited cartridge space, I somehow doubt that the Japanese version of this game actually bothered to flesh out their main characters to any degree. Because the ESRB didn't exist at the time this game came out, Nintendo of America instead preferred to self-regulate its own content. Because of this, in an attempt to appease parental groups of the United States, the American branch of Nintendo refused to allow any references to death in the English version of this game. This was problematic for this game since there were indeed plenty of characters who clearly died during the course of it. When I first read that overt references to the death were removed, I was worried that this game was going to be kind of like the early English dub of Dragon Ball Z. whereby they tried to remove even the very concept of death altogether by instead referring to characters passing into another dimension. However, much to my delight, this game still referenced death. For example, when Anna dies, it is explained that she jumped in front of some arrows to protect her boyfriend, Prince Edward. Obviously, that means she's dying, right? Later, Tella even outright says that Golbez took Anna's life. How is that not an overt reference to death? It seems that Nintendo of America wasn't really opposed to references to death, just not using the exact words death, die, or kill. However, you can very easily convey to the audience that characters are dying without having to say the word death, just like how you can easily convey to your audience that two characters in a story are having sex without needing to show any explicit nudity, or how you can convey that a character is angry without needing him to say a cuss word. As it stands, if I didn't already know that overt references to death were supposed to be removed, I would have never noticed that anything was missing. Rather, this version of the English translation, compared to later English translations of this game, honestly feels like just a different person doing the translation, rather than it being an issue of censorship. Whenever Japanese stories get translated into English, especially when they are translated by fans, and therefore often have multiple people doing the translations, it is not uncommon for different translations to have slight changes on a sentence-by-sentence basis, while still conveying the most important ideas. This English translation of the game honestly feels like just another equally valid translation from Japanese to English, not one that went out of its way to remove references to death. The closest this game's censorship ever came to being even mildly annoying was when the group was reuniting with Sid after Yang's supposed death. When Sid asks where Yang is, the main character's explanations of what happened is removed in its entirety and replaced with ellipses. This is the one time a reference to death was made when I can tell that something was actually taken out, rather than just an alternate translation of the original story that simply didn't use the word death. However, even that could be rationalized by suggesting that the main characters are so overcome with grief that they can't bring themselves to say the words out loud, and Sid simply reads their expressions and puts two and two together. Alternatively, seeing as we, the audience, already know exactly what happened, perhaps this was just a time skip. In-universe, the heroes bring Sid up to speed, but the game uses a time skip to skip past the exposition we already know. There's another moment shortly after that where the Dwarf King is similarly brought up to speed, only for the game to skip over the repeat exposition with ellipses so the audience doesn't have to read it twice. As I mentioned earlier, the inability at the time to simply increase the cartridge space meant that the English translation would inevitably have to remove some stuff, and repeat exposition is a prime candidate for something to remove that won't hurt the overall story that much and would perhaps even improve its pacing. However, the dialogue wasn't the only thing that was changed in the English translation of this game. Fearing that us stupid Americans wouldn't be able to handle the intense difficulty of the Japanese version of this game, they decided to heavily tone down the difficulty. This version would eventually be released in Japan as Final Fantasy IV Easy. Included among the difficulty-reducing changes for this game are the elimination of all items that remove specific status ailments, instead replacing them with a single item called Heal, which removes all status ailments, as well as making ether more plentiful in the game. Apparently, in the Japanese version, ether was extremely rare. However, assuming without conceding that ether is more plentiful in this game, it certainly doesn't appear to be more affordable. Ether is still expensive out the asshole, costing an astronomical 10,000 gold pieces a piece. I mean, Jesus Christ, do you think that's enough? It's almost like they didn't want us to use spells in this game or something. In any event, I will not be referring to the original Japanese version of this game outside of this one section of the video, all due to one principle. If the English version of this game is not a fun and enjoyable game in its own right, it doesn't deserve to exist. A game should not rely on the fact that it's an adaptation as an excuse to be a bad game. So I will not be concerning myself outside of this section with whether the original Japanese version was better, only whether this version is good. So, to decide if it's good, let's begin talking about the game proper, starting with... So, Final Fantasy IV is making the leap to the 16-bit generation of consoles, so you would expect it to be a huge step up, graphically speaking, from the 8-bit trilogy of games, right? Well, not really. Here's a couple of clips from Final Fantasy I and Final Fantasy IV side by side. The first game is on the left, the fourth game is on the right. As you can see, the texture quality is not really all that much better in the fourth installment, despite having twice the graphical horsepower as its 8-bit predecessors. In both instances, the grass is literally just a solid green block. The stairs are both literally just some solid white rectangles placed next to each other in a pattern that vaguely resembles a staircase, and the bricks are just solid color squares with some squiggly lines inside them. The only real improvements to the graphics is that the battle screens are now full fleshed out backgrounds, whereas the NES games just had the battle take place on a blank black space with a ribbon above the characters to give a vague idea of where the battle is supposed to be taking place. Now, maybe you could argue that this lack of stepping up the graphics is primarily the result of the developers at Square still becoming acclimated with the new hardware, and maybe that is the case. However, the reasons for why the graphics don't make much of an improvement over the previous console ultimately don't matter. Besides, even if that were the case, that only begs the question, why couldn't they flesh out the story more if they weren't going to improve the graphics? The first generation Super Famicom cartridge could hold a megabyte of data, whereas the last generation of Famicom cartridges could hold 512 kilobytes. If they weren't going to improve the graphics, then they would have no business not using that extra 512 kilobytes of storage space to write additional dialogue to flesh out the story. Instead, it just feels like the graphics for this game took up additional cartridge space, but didn't provide any actual updated visuals to show for it. So technologically, the graphics disappoint. Artistically speaking, they're nothing to write home about either. However, there is one aspect of the graphics that I actively dislike, and that's Cecil's appearance after he class changes. He starts the game as a Dark Knight, but changes his class to a Paladin. He's the only playable character in the game to get a class change like that. However, his appearance after the class change, with his purple hair, his yellow cape, and his bright red armor, well, it looks gay. Now, before anyone out there has a heart attack, let me make one thing perfectly clear. If Cecil were actually gay in the story, I wouldn't care. Hell, it would be cool that a society as conservative as Japan was being so progressive all the way back in 1991. No, my problem isn't with Cecil as a character. Well, yeah, I have problems with Cecil as a character, but I'll get into that later in this video. Rather, his outfit just looks way too flamboyant. It doesn't look like it would strike fear into the hearts of his enemies, and best, it looks like it's designed to be a distraction, or to lull the enemy into a false sense of security. Hell, when he wakes up from sleeping in an inn, he even does this girly-ass pose as he wakes up.
It's okay to be gay, let's rejoice with the boys in the gay way.
When I read that Nobuyo Uematsu, who did the atrocious, ear-splitting soundtracks for the 8-bit games, was also doing the score for this game, I was prepared for the worst. As I pointed out in my review of Final Fantasy I, his musical talent was just not up to scratch. However, to my pleasant surprise, this game's score is surprisingly decent. There's not much I can say about this game's soundtrack that isn't repetitive of the observations I've made in the past 2 games, so I won't bore you with analysis I've already done. I'll be playing various bits of the score in the background throughout this video, and sometimes I forget to turn the music down so you can't hear my commentary, and I have to go back and re-upload the video. Yeah, sorry when that happens. So you can hear the music and see why I think it's a not completely shitty song that way. However, there is at least one aspect of the score that is worth commenting on. You may recall, in my Final Fantasy III retrospective, that the music for regular battles in that game sounded like a remix of the Culex theme from Super Mario RPG. Well, that music is also present in this game. However, the boss fight music in this game isn't just a remix of the Culex theme. It flat out is the Culex theme, literally note for note. I'm frankly astonished that the YouTube Content ID system is somehow able to tell the difference between this theme, which I've gotten copyright claims on whenever I uploaded the raw footage of my playthrough as unlisted videos for cloud storage, and the Culex theme, which doesn't typically get claimed by YouTube. Of course, that isn't the only music from this game that seems to have either been copied into or served as inspiration for music in Super Mario RPG. So overall, the graphics are a disappointment, both technically and artistically. However, that balances it out now that Uematsu is finally starting to get the hang of how to actually write music for video games that doesn't suck. If you've been following my channel for a while now, you know the phrase I'm about to say. 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. The controls in this game are downright baffling. Once again, the X button is what brings up the status menu for this game. However, the start button does indeed pause the game whenever you're in battle. For the first time in the series, you can actually pause the game while in battle, more on that in the next section. However, on the overworld, the start button does nothing. Meanwhile, during battle, the X button does nothing. So why don't you just have one button perform both functions, since the 2 functions will never conflict with each other anyway, and they're basically the same function any damn way. The R button allows you to switch which player appears as your character's avatar in the overworld. However, aside from aesthetics, this doesn't really affect anything. You would expect that the NPCs would have different dialogue depending on which character you're playing as. Perhaps treat the ladies in your group with a bit more horniness than the men, or perhaps being more afraid of Dark Knight Cecil and be more willing to give information if he isn't the one talking to the NPC. If this was meant to be a mechanic but was instead removed in the aforementioned 75% of dialogue that had to be removed due to cartridge limitations, well then, they should have also removed the ability to switch the characters around as well, since as it stands, it's nothing but a palette swap. Meanwhile, the Y and L buttons appear to do absolutely nothing, whether in combat or in the overworld. However, in dialogue, they do something, and it's something I really dislike. Whenever you're in dialogue, every button on the controller, except the L button, can be used to fast-track the conversation. Except the L button, which does nothing. Why? Why do you need more than a single button to fast-track the dialogue? Having multiple buttons to fast-track only increases the chances that I will accidentally fast-track past some dialogue I actually wanted to read. And this game has no mercy when it comes to fast-tracking. You cannot go back and reread sections of dialogue for any reason. You can talk to an NPC again and hopefully go through their dialogue a second time, but if it's plot-specific dialogue that you just accidentally fast-tracked through, you're fucked. I get that the benefits of having the option to fast-track conversations outweigh the potential disadvantages, but it really should have been only a single button to do that. But even if you must have multiple buttons be viable options for fast-tracking, why make it so that the L button, and only the L button, is the only button that doesn't do that? That just makes absolutely no sense. As far as gameplay is concerned, there's really nothing but random battles to speak of. Granted, the past 3 games were also nothing but random battles too, but as I mentioned in my Final Fantasy I retrospective, I'm willing to give those games half a pass, since, unlike the soundtrack, that really is something that is limited by the hardware. But I'm putting my foot down here because the hardware is no longer a limitation. There is no reason not to give us a variety of stuff to do. Nothing but endless repetitive fights is just boring. Compare that to Skyrim, a game that is often criticized by its haters as being comprised of little more than fetch quests and dungeons. However, that is an unfair generalization. Sure, there's plenty of dungeon crawling, but there's also crafting, sneaking, dialogue trees. Hell, even the main quest of that game, often criticized even by those who love the game as being composed of little more than dragons and Draugr, knows how to break up its constant fighting with exposition quests, infiltration quests, political bickering quests. Right now, you're probably thinking, now come on Acerthorn, that's not fair, Skyrim came out a long time after this game, and on much more powerful hardware. Okay then, how about the game I grew up with that was released on the same console as Final Fantasy IV, and was even co-developed by Square, Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars. That game was pretty linear compared to Skyrim, and fighting enemies certainly comprised the bulk of the game's runtime. However, it wasn't just fighting. The game knew how to break up the monotony with things like musical segments, puzzle-solving segments, platforming segments, and that never changed. Even the final 2 dungeons of the game, Bowser's Keep and Smithy's Factory, had puzzle and platforming segments in them. Final Fantasy IV, however, has hardly anything to do in the game except the constant fights, and even they are not executed well. As I was doing research for this retrospective video, I read that the game had been retweaked so that the grinding was no longer necessary. It was not until the final dungeon of the game that I found myself against a foe that I simply couldn't defeat at my current level, and that was an optional boss, so I will give him credit there. However, that doesn't mean the game is well balanced. When Rydia and Tella are added to my party, they are significantly weaker than Cecil is, and they have a really hard time fighting off the enemies in the area I find myself in. Now, in any other RPG, I could simply backtrack to an earlier part of the game and grind on the enemies there. However, that section of the game map was quarantined off to me due to an earthquake, so I didn't have that option there. I had to use a cheat code that enabled me to get about 50 times as much experience as normal for killing imps, just to bring Rydia and Tella up to par to be able to stand toe-to-toe with the enemies that appear in this section of the game. If it weren't for that cheat code, I probably would have had to grind, which is precisely what is supposed to be unnecessary with this installment. Then there are the enemies that are really all about trial and error. The boss fight against Sandy, Cindy, and Mindy is one of the most egregious examples of this. The tall sister casts heal on the other 2 sisters, while the fat one in the middle casts wall on the tall one. So I can't use any spells to take the tall one out. I found myself constantly reloading save states because I kept running into dead ends with these girls. I eventually learned to take out the fat sister first, disable the tall sister's wall protection, and then take out the tall sister. The CPU, attacker, and defender are another example of a trial and error boss fight. If I took out both the attacker and defender, the CPU would use an instant death spell on 2 of my characters before bringing the attacker and defender back. But if I had left the defender alive, he would just heal the CPU. It took me about a half a dozen tries before I realized that I needed to intentionally leave the attacker alive while I took out the CPU. Now, some people may find those 2 boss fights endearing. Whereas I call it trial and error, others may say that these boss fights require strategy. And while I certainly found these fights to be more frustrating than anything, I can certainly see a case to be made in their defense. What I cannot see a case being made for, however, is the trap doors in the sealed cave. These aren't as cheap as the imps in Final Fantasy II that spammed the confusion spell every turn, but they're up there. I would probably say that these trapdoors are about as cheap as Yo Mama. Whereas the CPU will use an instant death attack if you kill both of its companions, the trapdoor just busts out an instant death move immediately. With the CPU, I was at least able to figure out a pattern that allowed me to avoid the instant death. I was not able to avoid the instant death with the trapdoors. What makes the trapdoors even more frustrating is that you have to fight them to make progress in that dungeon, and you have to fight them multiple times. I hope you've brought yourself plenty of life potions, formerly known as Phoenix Downs, because you're going to be using them in this dungeon. Hell, even the white spell Life can't be relied upon in this dungeon, since Rosa has just as much of a chance of getting hit with the instant death attack as any of the other characters. You know how much these trapdoors pissed me off? After the sealed cave, we finally get a wide assortment of side quests that we can do that are optional to complete the game. Yes, for the first time in the series, we actually have some optional content. However, after completing the sealed cave, the trapdoors had pissed me off so much that I didn't even care anymore about the side quests. It would have just been more dungeons and fighting anyway, so I decided to beeline straight to the end of the game. That's how much these trapdoors pissed me off. So I spent the past few minutes talking about how much the various enemies pissed me off. I suppose I should also discuss the combat system in this game. That leads me to... Final Fantasy IV is the first game in the series to feature an active time battle system. Whereas previously, the player would simply assign moves to the 4 characters and then wait patiently as the heroes and enemies each did their moves in a random order, for Final Fantasy IV, Sakaguchi apparently wanted combat to be more engaging, and to have the player constantly be actively involved in the battle. To do this, he created what is known as the Active Time Battle system, whereby the player is constantly actively involved in the battle. So, did it succeed in making the combat more engaging? Fuck no! So what exactly does the Active Time Battle system entail? Basically, all it means is that some people's attacks will play out before you've selected other people's attacks. That's it. That's quite literally all there is to it. There's really no more nuance to it besides that. There are 2 primary caveats to this system that keep it from being a success. The first is that while the characters can perform attacks while others have yet to select their attacks, only one character can actually do their attack animations at a time. Second, the menu to select an attack does not appear while enemies are attacking. These 2 caveats combine to make the Active Time Battle system both incredibly random and incredibly chaotic. While you're selecting your attack, the enemies have a free shot to attack you as well. This means that I have to select my attacks quickly in order to keep pace with the attacking enemies. I can't properly plan my attacks out. Hey, I wonder what this sight spell does. Well, I don't exactly have time to ponder that question since I'm under enemy fire. Because of this, I often find myself using the same attacks every time, since they're the ones I already know and therefore requires the least amount of thought on my end. And I get the feeling that this is not only inconsistent with Sakaguchi's vision, but was in fact the complete opposite of what he was trying to accomplish with this combat system. Now granted, as I mentioned earlier, this is the first game in the series where you can pause the game during combat. This is the only time in the entire game that the start button is actually used. You would think that the ability to pause the battle would negate the complaint I made about being unable to properly strategize. However, there's just one teensy-weensy problem with this mechanic. It doesn't work! As you can see here, I have the battle paused, yet I am still under enemy fire. So, me pausing the game literally doesn't even pause the fucking game. For that matter, I can't even navigate the character's attack menus while the game is paused. This means that I can't take an inventory of the items I have, scroll through my mage's various spells, or have access to most of the information I need in order to make an informed decision about how to attack. Then there's the fact that I cannot select attacks while the enemy is attacking me. This is especially annoying when I find myself fighting numerous enemies, each of which have very quick attacks. When enemies have quick attacks, those attacks are admittedly much weaker than the slower attacks, so I will give Sakaguchi credit for at least trying to achieve a balance. However, the sheer frequency of their attacks, combined with the fact that I can't select an attack while they're attacking, means that I am often left just waiting patiently for the game to arbitrarily decide it's finally my turn to attack again. The simple act of allowing me to select attacks even while the enemies were attacking would have done wonders to alleviate this problem. After all, they can attack me while I'm attacking them, so why not give me the same ability? Once again, I turn to Super Mario RPG on the Super NES to show them how it's done. In that game, you select a character's attack, then the attack plays out. Then you select the attack for some other character. Recall that I brought it up in my Final Fantasy I retrospective as an example of how it was not better, but different than that game's wave-based combat system. However, this time around there's no two ways about it. Super Mario RPG's combat system is not only different from Final Fantasy IV's combat system, but is hands down better. The fact that only one character attacks at a time means that I am still engaged in the battle constantly. I can only go a few seconds, if even that much, before it's time for me to give more input on the controller. Second, even while the attack animations are playing out, the vast majority of attacks have a timed hit mechanic to them, which can be used both offensively and defensively. This means that even while the attack animations are playing, I am still actively engaged in the battle. However, the fact that each fighter in the battle only attacks one at a time also means that the battle is not absolute mayhem like it is here. Once one of my characters has his attack menu up, the battle will not advance until I select an attack. I can take as long as I want to consider my options, take an inventory of my items, or even go and do other things like taking a piss, answering the phone or door, etc., etc. I can't pause the game while I am in battle, but unless the enemies are attacking me, I don't exactly need to. And those attack waves are usually over quickly enough that, with maybe a handful of exceptions, like a call from some super important person, I can usually afford to wait for me to get control of one of my characters again before I leave the game unattended. As it stands, however, this game made an attempt to make the fighting more engaging, but oh my god, did it backfire. It was nothing but chaos in nearly every battle. I didn't feel engaged. I felt like I was running around like a chicken with my head cut off. Final Fantasy IV is often heralded as the godfather of the story-driven RPG. As Hironobu Sakaguchi himself attests, he prefers telling stories over making action games. So let's take a look at how well this game handles its story and characters, shall we? The main character is Cecil. Other characters cycle in and out from time to time, but Cecil is the one character who stays in the party from beginning to end. He starts the game as a commander of the Red Wing, the main villains of the story. He is tasked with securing a crystal for the king, and to do so at any cost. Since the locals are not willing to give up the crystal lightly, that means he is forced to either kill or arrest them to complete his mission. He resents having to take innocent lives just for some stupid jewelry, and this eventually drives him to launch rebellion against his home country. This makes his character arc pretty baffling to me. He is told that he cannot hope to resolve this conflict until he abandons the evil in his heart. This is what compels him to embark on that quest to become a paladin and get his gay-ass new armor. However, it is clear that he has been a good guy all along. He laments the atrocities he has committed in the king's name. He egregiously apologizes to Rydia for killing her mom, more on that in a minute. He clearly already is a good guy. As anyone who has seen my Splinter Cell Blacklist retrospective knows, I love me a good redemption arc in my characters. However, the whole redemption arc doesn't exactly work when the character doing the arc doesn't need redeeming in the first place. Speaking of Rydia, she's the third character to join your party. She initially doesn't trust you, and for good reason. As you were taking a package to her village, not realizing that the package was a bomb, you end up killing a Mr. Dragon on the way to that village. But this ends up killing the caller who summoned that Mr. Dragon. That caller ended up being Rydia's mom. So Rydia has every right not to trust Cecil, until he fights off a bunch of soldiers who wanted to kill her. That being said, I really do not like how she overcomes her fear of fire so quickly. There is a wall of ice blocking our path, and she's the only one in the group at the moment who can perform black magic. So her travel companions encourage her to cast a fire spell to melt the ice. However, she can't bring herself to do so. Now, I can understand why she would be so adverse to fire, since that bomb package ended up burning her village to the ground. However, I do not appreciate how this fear of fire is brought up and then resolved immediately. The conflict is resolved literally as soon as it gets brought up. The subplot doesn't even have a middle or even a beginning, it literally just has an ending. Imagine, if you will, the ending of Homeward Bound: The Incredible Journey, where Peter is sad that Shadow wasn't able to find his way home, only for Shadow to limp his way up the hill. Now, imagine if that wasn't the ending to that movie, but was in fact the entire fucking story. Some random ass boy is sad that his dog is presumed dead, and then that dog just shows up the fuck out of nowhere. That's basically how I feel about Rydia overcoming her fear of fire. Even in terms of gameplay, it only really seems to be in the game, so that Rydia couldn't melt the ice wall before the game was ready for us to go down that path. However, we already had another wizard named Tilla in our party, who did know the fire spell. We couldn't melt the ice then, because we couldn't use attack spells outside of combat except in this one scripted instance. So clearly the game was already going to gate off this section of the map until this moment anyway. So we didn't need this completely rushed character arc about overcoming one's fears. Or if you had to have that character arc, make an actual subplot out of it. Make it so that this character arc has a clear beginning, middle, and end to it. However, to balance that out, one thing I really love about Rydia is how she actually returns to the group of her own accord later in the game. At some point, the group gets shipwrecked and separated while Rydia is presumed dead. However, it is later revealed that she didn't die, but instead got warped to the dimension where the creatures that a caller can summon normally hang out wherein they're not being summoned to fight. Time passes faster in that dimension, so Rydia appears all grown up when she returns. Why do I love this? Because it etches in stone just how much she has come to trust Cecil. Sure, she starts to trust him after he fights off those soldiers, but for all we know at that point, she could just be hanging around Cecil for her own benefit, since it's the lesser of two evils compared to being killed by the soldiers. But here, she was safe and happy in the land of summonable creatures. She could have just stayed there, but like Belle in Beauty and the Beast, she came back of her own accord, and that is fucking awesome. This isn't like Leela's return in Final Fantasy II either. Rydia was never evil to begin with. Her character arc, well, the one that was actually any good, was learning to trust Cecil. Leela returning to the fight of her own accord made no sense because she was a pirate, a cutthroat, who simply owed the heroes a favor for not killing her when they had the chance. Rydia was a good guy who rejoined the fight because she had grown to care for Cecil and didn't want to see him die a horrible death if she could have lifted so much as a finger to aid him. Of course, for every character this game does well, there are two characters the game fails to give literally any character development towards whatsoever. Yang, Kain, Cid, Fusoya are all completely blank slates. Palam and Poram are playful at times, but their only real impact on the story is sacrificing themselves by turning themselves to stone to keep a building from collapsing in on us. The only real emotion in that moment is how a couple of little kids had needlessly killed themselves when it should have been the responsibility of the adults to make such a sacrifice. However, I'm honestly pissed off that the game is even putting these literal children into unspeakable danger in the first place. At least with Final Fantasy III, the ages of the Warriors of the Light were left ambiguous, and it was only through my reading between the lines that I deduced that they were under the age of 16. But here, Palam and Poram are just kids, and the game isn't even trying to hide it. Then there's Edge. Sadly, he does not have the ability to equip spears and use them as weapons, despite that being expected of a guy called Edge. He is essentially a blank slate alongside Yang, Kain, and Fusoya, except for one moment. At the very end of the game, after we've defeated the final boss, then and only then does the game decide to give him a character trait by having him have a crush on Rydia. Literally the game's epilogue, he has this character trait about him. It would have been interesting to actually explore that crush during the actual story. Maybe give him and Rydia a romance subplot on par with Cecil and Rosa, or perhaps have Edge constantly mag on Rydia, only for Rydia to be wholly indifferent to his affections. Something? Anything? Edward, meanwhile, is a bard prince who has puppy love for Anna, the daughter of Tella, another playable character I'll mention in a minute. I call it puppy love because, well, the two had just met. Hell, Anna runs off with Edward to live together because she knows full well that her father Tella would not approve of their relationship, which in turn means that they had literally just met, because, frankly, that's the only reason I can think of for why Tella wouldn't approve of his daughter marrying into literal royalty and living in a castle. It's not because Edward is abusive either. He seems like a genuinely nice guy when he joins the party. So, clearly it's because the two of them just met. Despite the lack of time spent together, Anna still feels the need to jump in front of some arrows to save Edward's life, proclaiming with her dying breath that she loves Edward and has no regrets about saving him. I honestly don't buy it. Puppy love may feel even better in the moment than true love, but it's the epitome of instant versus delayed gratification. This presents a golden opportunity for Edward to undergo a character arc about learning the difference between puppy love and true love, but sadly this aspect of Edward's character development goes entirely unexplored. The first night after he joins the group, he heads outside to play his harp, gets into a fight with a sea creature, and then talks to Anna's ghost. It is unclear whether this is actually him talking to Anna's ghost or if it's just a dream. and I quite prefer it being left ambiguous. However, one thing I feel they absolutely dropped the ball on with Edward's character is how he just randomly gets psychic powers. Like Rydia, he too is separated from the group in the aforementioned shipwreck. We eventually meet him bedridden and being tended to by some doctors. There he gives us one of his harps. Later, when we find ourselves paralyzed by the next dungeon's boss, Edward somehow just knows that we're in danger and goes to get his other harp. Now, I can buy that the two harps are magically synchronized, so that when he plays one song, that same song will also play on the partner harp, allowing its magic to release us from our bonds. But how the fuck did he just magically know that we needed his help in that exact moment? There is no explanation whatsoever as to how he knows this. Is it because the harp he gave us lets us eavesdrop on him? Just like the stone from the Wind Waker? Well, no, that can't be it, because he has to get out of bed and crawl across the room to get his own harp. So he didn't have the harp with him when he sensed we were in danger. The knowledge that we needed his help just came out of thin fucking air. Last but not least, we have Tella, and he has the best character arc in the entire story, bar none. As I mentioned earlier, he's Anna's father. He initially starts a fight with Edward, while Edward constantly tries to reason with him. This sets up his primary character trait for the entire game. His overwhelming sense of paternal duty to Anna prevents him from seeing any and all reason. When Anna dies, he swears vengeance for her death, and then charges off to obtain the Meteos spell, which I assume is this game's version of Ultima given its legendary status, the fact that it's the most powerful spell in the game, and the fact that obtaining it requires a quest in its own right. We eventually meet him just as he obtains the legendary spell. Around the same time, Cecil gets his gay-ass uniform, and he rejoins the team. Later, when we confront Golbez, the anger that was shown when he engaged with Edward resurfaces, and he is once again overcome with rage and vengeance and won't listen to his friends. He knows the Meteos spell will destroy his body if he uses it, since he's long removed from his physical prime. But if it means taking Golbez with him, if it means bringing justice to the man who killed his daughter, he is willing to make that sacrifice. Unfortunately, there is one little X-factor he didn't take into account. Golbez was strong enough to withstand a single Meteos strike. The whole idea of using an uber-powered suicide spell to take out your opponent as well as you sounds super noble on paper, except you have to be 100% certain that it will actually succeed in taking out your opponent. As it stands, Tella does little more than kill himself. Tella's story is a tragedy. Not a tragic story, but a tragedy. That is to say, it's a story of a man brought to ruin primarily through his own poor decisions. Tella was warned numerous times by his allies that his heart was in the right place, but he was going about it the wrong way. The protagonists repeatedly warned him that he can't do it alone, that they stand the best chance of success if they all worked together. They also repeatedly warned him that his rage is only getting in the way of his judgment, and that he was being incredibly reckless. But he refuses to listen. When he sees the guy who killed his daughter, or in Edward's case, the guy he thinks killed his daughter, he is beyond all reason. His repeated failure to heed his companion's multiple warnings ultimately proves to be his undoing. This is the best character arc in the entire game, bar none. It's probably the only character arc in the game that has a clear beginning, middle, and end, and it is grounded in a very relatable conflict, the desire to avenge the cold-blooded murder of your own daughter. So, with the exception of Rydia and Tella, the characters are a bit of a disappointment. Rydia and Tella's character arcs, Fear of Fire notwithstanding, add some emotional weight to the story, whereas everyone else just seems to have gotten lost in the shuffle or are giving character arcs out of flipping nowhere. So the main conflict of this game is that the Red Wings, the army of Baron, the most powerful country in the world, are going around pillaging innocent villages in search of the light crystals. You know, considering that Baron is the most powerful country in the world, I wonder if that's meant to be a subtle jab at the United States. Anyway, the king will entertain no opposition to his crusade. When Cecil even so much as asks about the reason for their mission, let alone full-on defies the king, he is relieved of duty and demoted to mere courier duty. At first, it seems that this demotion itself is the punishment for his insolence, but then it turns out that he was actually delivering a bomb that would kill most of the villagers, disguised as a package so Cecil wouldn't question it. This pushes Cecil over the edge and he decides to launch a rebellion against the Kingdom of Baron. Sadly, that plot never gets underway since it is eventually revealed that the king is actually the water fiend in disguise. The real king is dead, and some guy named Golbez is the one who's actually pulling the strings. Cecil and company then decide to dedicate their efforts to finding the light and dark crystals in order to prevent Golbez from doing whatever he's planning on doing with the crystals. However, what really baffles me is that despite the fact that the Royal House of Baron has been exonerated, and it has now been proven that the king isn't the one actually ordering the Red Wings to do this pillaging, the Red Wings continue to be the arm of the villains for most of the game. That makes no sense. So we embark on our quest to obtain the crystals. However, the Red Wings are always one step ahead of us. We get to a crystal only to find out it's either already been collected by the Red Wings, or the Red Wings are in the process of collecting it. We never get a crystal of our own, so Golbez is able to do what he was hoping to do with the crystals, reawaken the Giant of Babel. The Giant was housed inside the Tower of Babel, and seeing as it was designed to reach the moon, it's pretty clear that this was inspired by the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, a tower which was never completed, but which was supposed to reach the sky when complete. One thing I don't like about this game's story is its overuse of the brainwashed plot device. As I mentioned in my Final Fantasy II retrospective, that was what Leon desperately needed in order for his sudden forgiveness for his war crimes to make even the slightest bit of sense. I also praised the use of this plot device in Final Fantasy III, as it allowed the King of Saronia to be properly redeemed for his actions. However, this game took the idea of having someone be brainwashed as a means of sweeping his crimes under the rug and just overused it to the point where it just doesn't work anymore. This game is like the Oprah Winfrey of brainwashings. You get a brainwashing, and you get a brainwashing, and you get a brainwashing. Everyone gets a brainwashing. At one point, the game almost seems to acknowledge how this trope is being overused to the point of losing its punch. Right before the climax, Cain asks to come along, despite having been brainwashed twice already. His companions warn him that brainwashing will no longer be an excuse for his treachery, and if it happens a third time, they may have no choice but to kill him, as a preventive rather than punitive measure. On top of that, the lore for how brainwashing works is ridiculously inconsistent. It is said that Golbez was able to be brainwashed by Zemus because Golbez is a Lunarian, a race of moon dwellers whose brains are more susceptible to outside control. However, Cecil is revealed to be Golbez's younger brother and he is never brainwashed. Meanwhile, Cain and Yang both get brainwashed at various points during the game and they're not Lunarians. So what gives? Pick a rule for brainwashing and stick with it. Oh, and as you may have noticed during that rant, Golbez, the one who killed the king and is controlling the fiends, was also brainwashed. Remember earlier when the game felt compelled to swap out the main villains for no good reason? Well, it turns out that this game just can't keep it in its pants. Sakaguchi felt compelled to swap out main villains in this game not once, not twice, but 3 times. First it was the King of Baron, then it's this Golbez guy, then it's this Zemus guy, then at the very last minute, literally right before the final boss fight, the final boss is changed from Zemus to this Zeromus guy. No, seriously, at least the Cloud of Darkness in Final Fantasy III had at least one whole dungeon's worth of build-up to it. This game's final boss has absolutely fuck all build-up to him. It would have been bad enough if the game had swapped out Golbez for Zemus and left it at that. But here, we go through the entire final dungeon, expecting to find Zemus at the end of it, and we eventually do encounter Zemus at the end. Then, as we are preparing to fight Zemus, the game decides to bait and switch us and swap out Zemus for Zeromus, a guy who we never met before and who has received precisely zero build-up or character development this entire game. What the hell, Sakaguchi? What the hell? Imagine if you were watching the movie Rocky, and you saw Rocky's rivalry with Creed build up for the entire movie. Rocky trains to fight Creed. Then, on New Year's Day, the writers just decide to swap out Creed for whatever reason. Maybe he got the flu or something, maybe he pulled a muscle during his training, whatever. And instead have Rocky fight this complete random nobody who we've never seen or even heard of before. Wouldn't that feel like a fucking cop-out? Once again, let's turn to Super Mario RPG to show them how it's done. In that game, the main villain is Smithy. That was established early on and it never changed. Sure, we never met Smithy until the very end, but he was clearly built up as the main villain for the entire game. But here, this game is more schizophrenic than the Majin Buu saga of Dragon Ball Z. At least, that show only had multiple versions of the same villain rather than swapping out main villains altogether every 5 episodes. Hell, even the Cell Saga, which did have the main villains get swapped out, only did so twice, whereas this game does it 3 times. And at least that manga had the excuse that each chapter was being published once a week, whereas this game had to be finalized before even the first scene could be released to the public. So no, there is absolutely no excuse for the game's story being this schizophrenic. Sakaguchi just fucked up, and there's no two ways about it. However, all of that pales in comparison to what happens immediately before we begin the dungeon inside the Giant of Babel. Bear in mind that up until this point, the primary source of drama and tension in this story has come from characters dying. Some characters are killed by the villains, others sacrifice themselves. But the biggest thing that makes the villains such a formidable threat is how the good guys are dying left, right, and center. So, you can probably imagine my irritation when we are preparing to storm the inside of the Giant of Babel, and several characters previously thought to be dead show up alive and fucking well. Halam and Param turned themselves to stone to save us? Well, we get a throwaway line about how some guy had removed their petrification, despite the fact that their petrification was previously shown to be irreversible. Later, Yang throws us out of a control room so that he can destroy the controls, but getting caught in the blast radius himself. However, at the beginning of the Giant of Babel dungeon, Yang is shown to be alive and well, leading an army of Fabul warriors into battle, and this time, we're given fuck all explanation as to how he survived or how he managed to return to the surface world. Hey guys, Acerthorn here. I just wanted to provide a quick correction that I noticed while I was editing this video together. It has since come to my attention that the game does indeed have a scene in it whereby Yang is shown to be alive, and it is indeed treated as a big deal. This was supposed to happen during one of the side quests I had chosen not to do because the trapdoor enemies in the sealed cave pissed me off to the point of just wanting to rush through the rest of the game. That being said, I stand by the criticism I made in this video for 2 reasons. First, because that was an optional side quest, that means that the main plot should have been written on the assumption that the player didn't do the side quest. So Yang just showing up out of the blue alive and well with no explanation as to how he was alive is still poor storytelling on Sakaguchi's part. Second, as I'm about to explain, the retconning of his death in the first place was a bad idea from a storytelling perspective. So while I will admit to that mistake, knowing the truth does not affect my overall opinion of this plot twist. Alright, recommencing retrospective in 3, 2, 1. Behold the disillusion of Tenshin! Up until this point, the Red Wings have always been one step ahead of the heroes, so they came off as a credible threat. But then, half the deaths they caused end up being retconned, so they come off as completely incompetent at killing people. The only named characters who stay dead are Tella and Anna, and I'm honestly shocked they didn't retcon their deaths too. Now, before anyone out there posts a comment, let me address the thing I know you're all thinking right now. Well, we never saw Yang's body, so it's not technically a plot hole. Yeah, you're missing the point. Whether Yang's non-death is a plot hole or not is not my point. My point is that this is shitty storytelling. Just like in Final Fantasy II, the constant death is one of the things that causes the villains of this game to be seen as a credible threat. If they can't even kill a couple of children who are actively trying to sacrifice their lives, then these villains honestly come off as incompetent buffoons. In Final Fantasy II, when characters died, they actually fucking died. Joseph, Minwu, the King, Gareth, when these characters die, they stay dead. The steadily growing body count adds to the drama and demonstrates how the Emperor must be stopped at all costs. But here, the King /Golbez /Zemu /Zeromus comes off as a guy who talks a big talk but who can't back up his words with actions. When I was doing research for this video, I read that there was supposed to be a couple of main themes. The idea that brute strength alone isn't power, and an overarching theme of family. Now, the family idea is technically in the game. Cecil and Golbez end up being brothers. When Cecil gets his gay-ass class change, a disembodied voice refers to him as his son. Tella loses his daughter Anna. Rydia loses her mom. So yes, a lot of the main characters do have family in the story. However, the main theme is never really explored. Aside from Tella and Anna, the game never really does anything with these blood ties. The familial relationships are just sort of there. Meanwhile, the other intended main theme, that of brute force alone not being the same thing as power, seems completely and utterly absent in this game. It doesn't even so much as get lip service, and believe me, I was constantly on the lookout for any signs of this main theme. Last but not least, I'm going to just throw this in at the last minute, because I can't find a more organic place to include it, but I still have to mention this because it just bugs the hell out of me. Right before the final dungeon of the game, Cecil insists that Rosa and Rydia get off the ship, presumably because he doesn't want to put the ladies in mortal peril. First of all, that makes absolutely no sense, because Rosa and Rydia have been fighting alongside Cecil this entire game, and Cecil didn't seem to mind up till now. Why is he only just now worried about these delicate little flowers being put in harm's way? For that matter, this just seems out of place for most Japanese fiction. While I am sure that Japan has their own set of gender roles, one thing I have noticed based on my entire lifetime of watching and playing Japanese pop culture is that women are considered just as capable of being warriors as men are. In fact, in stories that involve a team of warriors as opposed to a single one, it's often expected that the team contain at least one obligatory female in the group. Furthermore, unlike Mulan in China or Wonder Woman in the United States, these stories never seem to call attention to the fact that these women can kick just as much ass as the men despite being women. They're just fighting alongside the men and they just happen to be women. It's just not a big deal in Japanese pop culture. Second, after he lands on the moon and the three boys are prepared to embark, Rosa and Rydia show up again and beg to come along. After they've already flown to the moon. How the fuck did they manage that? So, overall, this story is just as sloppily handled as Final Fantasy III's story. Its conflict is all over the place. The few main themes that are supposed to be in the game are entirely unexplored, and in many places it seems that the story is going out of its way to not make sense. It's a fucking mess. So in conclusion, Final Fantasy IV was one of the most frustrating games I've ever played, both in gameplay and in story. The majority of the characters are undeveloped. The intended main themes are never explored. The story can't seem to settle on a main villain. The drama is undermined by retconning half the characters' deaths. The graphics don't take advantage of the new hardware's graphical capabilities. The gameplay consists of nothing but random battles, and the new combat system is so chaotic and so hectic that it prevents me from strategizing properly. The main plot is just as incoherent and jarbled as that of Final Fantasy III's main plot. However, the fact that this game makes at least some attempt to have a few of its main characters undergo character arcs causes this game to be just slightly better than Final Fantasy III in terms of story. For this reason, I rank Final Fantasy IV in between Final Fantasy III and Final Fantasy I. Next time, I will do a retrospective analysis of the last of the Sakaguchi-directed Final Fantasies, Final Fantasy V on the PS1 as part of the Final Fantasy Anthology series. Can Sakaguchi go out with a bang, or will it be for the best that he stepped down from game development? Only time will tell. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoyed this retrospective, please hit that subscribe button for more videos just like it. Also, if you enjoy my content overall, please consider supporting the channel directly, either with Patreon support or channel memberships. Silver and Gold level members and Patreon supporters are allowed to submit requests for video topics, and Gold members and Patreon supporters are allowed to directly assign me video topics that I am guaranteed to cover. In the meantime, however, I am Acer Thorn, and I will see you guys later. Peace!